All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. So we have made it to day 15 of the Heidelberg Catechism. It's 15 out of 52. It's one for each week of the year. And where we are right now, just to remind those of you that have been with us and orient newcomers, we're in the there's a good chunk of the Catechism that goes through the Apostles' Creed. So the articles of the Apostles' Creed, it says they're divided up into three parts. They treat God the Father and our creation, God the Son and our deliverance, God the Holy Spirit and our sanctification. And here's kind of a breakdown. You can see that the majority of the days are spent looking at God the Son. Although that's also, when you look at the Apostles' Creed itself, there's a lot more words devoted to Jesus than to God the Father or the Spirit. So here is the part of the Apostles' Creed that deals with Jesus. You might be used to hearing the kids sing this by now. I know that's now how I have it memorized. And Zacharias Ursinus, who wrote the Heidelberg Catechism and who also wrote a really good commentary about it, says that you can break these articles down into sections that deal with who Jesus is, like in his person, and then the role that he plays, his office. And then that office is broken down further into, on the one hand, he takes on our flesh. Ursinus refers to this as his humiliation and also his merit, where he takes on our flesh, lives a human life, dies a human death in our place, and merits atonement for us. And then secondly, his glorification and his power. Sort of, where he is now and where he will be. Today we're looking at this part. We're just looking at the part of the creed that says he suffered under Pontius Pilate and was crucified. So that is where we are. As we go along, feel free to jump in at any point to ask questions. I do have a couple discussion questions along the way here. So question 37 is the first one for today. It asks, what do you understand by the word suffered? And the answer is that during his whole life on earth, but especially at the end, Christ sustained in body and soul the anger of God against the sin of the whole human race. This he did in order that, by his suffering as the only atoning sacrifice, he might set us free, body and soul, from eternal condemnation, and gain for us God's grace, righteousness, and eternal life. And then it asks, why did he suffer under Pontius Pilate as a judge? It gives the answer, so that he, though innocent, might be condemned by a civil judge, and so free us from the severe punishment of God that was to fall on us. And then the last question for today is going to be, is it significant that he was crucified instead of dying some other way? And the answer it gives is yes. This death convinces me that he shouldered the curse which lay on me, since death by crucifixion was accursed by God. So those are the three catechism questions we'll be going through today. So now we'll start to unpack those. Are any questions or comments so far? But here's the question that I want to talk about a little bit. Why do the creeds, and for that matter, Paul, when you look at the way Paul writes about Jesus in the New Testament, they go straight from Jesus's birth to his death. So last week, the part of the creed we were looking at was he was born of the Virgin Mary. And then immediately it says he suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. Why do you think, the Gospels obviously don't do this. I mean, the Gospels spend some time in Jesus' life. We hear his teaching, we see his miracles. But why do you think it is that, the creeds that kind of distill the essentials, or Paul in writing Romans or writing Galatians, there's such a heavy emphasis on, well, not only an emphasis on Jesus' death and resurrection, but actually just almost a complete exclusion of everything else. What do you think? So here's Ursinus, makes reference to this verse. Very, very famous passage that talks about the life of suffering. Where it says that Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So it gets to that, especially at the end. But I think this verse, speaks to, his humiliation, his suffering, his humbling himself. That begins the moment that he takes the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. So, in this sense, there is some reference in the Catechism where it talks about him suffering, not only to his death but to his entire life. Any questions or any more thoughts about this? If you want to dig deep into this topic, this book by Thomas Weinandy is one of the best. And when I say deep, like this one, like, will really go into a lot of the early church history and the patristic sources and documents. It's readable. He's a very good writer, but it's dense for sure. So this idea that God, so we're talking here about Jesus living a life of suffering. In the 20th century, the idea that God suffers became, what many theologians have referred to as a new orthodoxy. And it was brand new. I mean, up until the 19th century, if you had asked any theologian, like, does God suffer? They would have, largely been able to say, God in his divinity does not suffer. That's part of what it means to be God. That's actually in the Westminster Shorter Catechism. It says that God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchanging. Unchanging, again, is that apatheia. It's without change and without suffering, since suffering is a subset of change. So that would have been like the standard answer, for for the first 19 centuries of the Christian faith. In the 20th century, though, that changes, and it's largely driven. I mean, it's two things. There's philosophical currents that lead into this, Kant and Hegel and folks like that. But I think much more significant is just history. Is just what happened in the 20th century. A lot of you may have read this book at some point. Elie Wiesel, Night, his memoir of having survived the Holocaust. This is probably his most famous work. He won a Nobel Peace Prize. Apparently, it got onto Oprah's book club, and the only image of it I could find had that little sticker on it. So there's that. But there's a very famous passage in this book where Wiesel is recounting a time that he saw a child executed in a concentration camp, and just for nothing, just treated as though his life were absolutely nothing, just murdered. And there's a crowd of people that see this, and they say, the child was hanged. They say, where is God? Like, where is God in all of this? And somebody says, there is God. He's there on the gallows. And that passage gets quoted. I mean, so there's an immediate resonance there with the cross, of course. In the 20th century, in the wake of World War II, in the wake of the Holocaust, countless theologians, and especially, interestingly, especially German and especially Japanese theologians, quote that passage. And develop a way of talking about God's suffering, which goes beyond saying that Jesus takes on our flesh, Jesus becomes human, Jesus suffers on the cross as a human being, and says, no, that suffering, that's God himself. God is suffering. God, suffering becomes a part of who God is. God's love for the world is so great that God does not hold himself back from any aspect of human experience. And so God, in his very divinity, in who he is a suffering God. Now that is powerful. That is evocative. You can understand, why like that resonates, with a lot of people. It's clearly meant to be comforting. It's clearly meant to be an encouragement to say that, on the heels of a century that saw atrocities that nobody could have believed, it seems like a really emphatic way of saying God is right there with us in the midst of that. So that's kind of the backgrounds for like where, by the time you get to the 80s and the 90s, that's when you look and like, it really does seem to be like a new orthodoxy. So I just want to talk briefly about why that's problematic. And what it is that we're really confessing, when we say that Jesus Christ suffered on the cross. And this briefly might seem really technical, but I promise it does matter, and I'll get there. But also stop and ask questions again. So okay. So like I said, like early Christianity did not say that God suffers in his very being, and this was a very important part. This was one of the key discussions surrounding our understanding of the incarnation. So in the 5th century, there was a bishop named Nestorius, and he had this very nice slogan. He was one of the leading theologians who were really working this out in the 5th century. And he had this slogan. He said, I unite, pertaining to Jesus, I unite the person in worship, but I divide the natures. Okay, so I worship one Jesus, but I keep the human and the divine natures separate from each other. And the reason he wanted to separate them was precisely this idea of suffering. He thought, if the human nature and the divine nature are brought too closely together, that precisely gets into this impact of that seems like that's God suffering on the cross, and you can't have that. You have to protect God from that. Now, if you remember the what the Chalcedonian definition says, when it talks about the two natures of Christ, remember it uses a whole lot of negative language. So it says that these two natures are united in one person, and it says without confusion on the one hand, but also without separation. So Cyril of Alexandria, he's one of the ones opposing Nestorius. He's one of the other key protagonists writing these things out. So Nestorius and Cyril are like the two names, to remember from the 5th century debates about the incarnation. Cyril is one of the main ones who actually contributes to writing the Chalcedonian definition. And for him, it was very important to say, yes, the two natures, they can't be confused. In other words, you can't say that Jesus as a human being is therefore a creature and he's finite. Well, that doesn't make God finite. God is still infinite, right? So you can't have confusion. But there's also no separation. He firmly opposed that idea that you actually had to hold the natures separate from each other, as though they're two objects like competing for physical space, right? You can't have two objects occupying the same space. But to Cyril, the fact that God is infinite means precisely that you don't have that. You don't have that issue of displacement. Cyril emphasized the hymn to Christ, the one that we just read in Philippians 2. So that's the early debate. Here's the thing. There's a fancy Latin term for this idea of without confusion, but this chart might help. Jesus is one person in two natures. Even that preposition matters. The Chalcedonian definition considered saying he's one person out of two natures. They said, no, that's not right, because out of sounds like you've got two types of material and you're forming a third kind of thing, like a hybrid that's neither fully one nor fully the other. So they said, nope, he's one person in two natures, human and divine. This Latin term, it means communication of idioms or communication of attributes. When you think about the attributes of the divine nature or the attributes of the human nature, it's correct to say, like this is classic Chalcedonian Christology, it's correct to say any attribute of the human nature can be attributed to the person. Okay, so the human nature is finite, Jesus is finite. And any attribute of the divine nature can also be attributed to the person. Okay, so you can simultaneously say, the human nature is finite, therefore you can say that Jesus is finite. You can also say the divine nature is infinite, and so Jesus, the person, is also infinite, at the same time. The thing that you can't do is allow for this, kind of back and forth. Jesus in his finite humanity does not somehow make the divine nature finite. The fact that the divine nature is omniscient, knows everything, does not mean that the human being, Jesus of Nazareth, knows everything, right? We actually have Jesus in scripture saying, I only know what the Father reveals to me. I myself don't know the hour of my own coming, right? So you don't get this back and forth across the two natures. Now, I want to now talk about why this matters. Okay, so that's hopefully the end of the technical arcane stuff, and talk about why this really matters to our faith. But are there any questions? Is there anything that's like really unclear about what I said? So the reason this matters is just that we understand that, Hebrews, so maybe Hebrews is kind of an exception to what that first question that I asked, when I asked why does Paul go straight to Jesus' death? Why do the creeds go straight to death? Hebrews, at least emphasizes this idea that in Jesus we have a high priest who identifies with us. We have one who is not aloof or oblivious to what it is to be human, but that he was tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet without sin. The problem with saying that Jesus' suffering means that God in his divinity suffers, that would mean that the suffering of Jesus is entirely different from ours. It would mean that his life is entirely different from ours. It would really render void the idea that Jesus truly identifies with us. He really lived a human life. He really suffered a human death. Rowan Williams, I think I'm paraphrasing Rowan Williams because I'm sure he uses more and more eloquent words. But I remember him saying, something in a talk, something like, there is no point in Jesus' life where the divine nature says to the human nature, stand aside, I'll take care of this, right? That never happens. If that did happen, then at that point, Jesus' life would not be a human life. And it would be no good to us. It wouldn't really be the substitute that we need. It wouldn't merit the righteousness that we need. He wouldn't really be the second Adam. That whole, that entire commitment that God shows in saying, I have not given up on humanity. We wouldn't have that. Here's a longish quote from David Bentley Hart. um, who says, the other thing that matters is that, if you say that the suffering on the cross or any of Jesus' suffering, works its way into God's divine being and changes who he is, makes him a suffering God, then you have a God who is dependent on his own creation. And what that risks is a picture in which, many of those 20th century theologians would say, look at how loving God is, right? Look at the response, look at the depths that he goes to. But they strayed into saying basically that the suffering made God more loving, right? That he allowed himself to actually be changed by this. The problem and the problem there is that makes love a response. It means in a strict sense, it would mean that the depths of God's love, who he is, depend on human evil, right? There had to be sin in order that God could respond to it, in order that he could be that merciful. And this is something we need to stay away from. So the longish quote here from David Bentley Hart, he says, if the nature of God's love can be in any sense positively shaped by sin, suffering, and death, then sin, suffering, and death will always be in some sense features of who he is. Goodness then requires evil to be good. Love must be goaded into being by pain. No, love is not primordially a reaction. It does not require our sin and death to show us mercy. God loved us when we were not, and by this very mercy called us into being. And this is the ground of all our hope. So for the sake of preserving, a God who is love in his very being, not as a reaction to evil, but in who he is. And by the way, that love is the shared unanimous love of all three persons of the Trinity, which sends the Son, right? And also in order to preserve the humanity of Christ as being truly, truly a human who can be the substitute that we need and the high priest that we need. For that reason, this technical separation not separation. This technical language avoiding attributing human features to the divine nature and vice versa. It really does matter. So, okay, so it talks about it talks about Jesus suffering for the whole human race, and in the commentary that he wrote on the Catechism, Ursinus, did take up the question of, well, wait a minute, did Jesus die for everybody, and does that mean everybody is saved? How do we understand that? He looked at, there's verses that suggest that would be the case. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. 1 John says he's the propitiation for our sins, and not only for ours also, but not only for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. That's the one that's maybe most direct in making you think that everyone's sins are atoned for, and not only those who profess faith. Against that, Ursinus points us to these passages, where Jesus talks about those that are of his flock and those who know him, and those significantly who have it, those who have been given to him and who cannot be snatched out of his hand. And in John 17, he says, "I'm praying for them." This is right at the end of his high priestly prayer. "I'm praying for them. I am not praying for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours." This is a question that definitely divides Christians. I have TULIP up there because there's lots of people who refer to themselves as 4-point Calvinists instead of 5, and it's usually the L, which stands for limited atonement. It's this question of, did Jesus's death cover everybody? And there are many Christians who will say L is the one that they most struggle with. I'll simply say, um, you know, recently, a lot of people talking about this have said, you know, it'd be better to talk not about limited atonement, but definite atonement or particular atonement, in the sense that, like, Jesus's death on the cross doesn't just offer salvation, but it effects salvation. It actually makes it happen. You know, in those to whom God gives the grace of regeneration and of faith. You know, the question is, you know, is there an offer out there? And if there is, if it's only an offer, then that is going to make our salvation depend on us, because, like, his part is making this offer, but then we have our part of accepting it. What Ursinus says about the phrase whole human race is simply that what this means is that Jesus' atoning sacrifice is completely unlimited as to its sufficiency. Like, it is sufficient for the sins of the whole world, but it's not unlimited as to its application. You guys have do you have questions about this one? Like I said, this can be a thorny issue. Well, just a couple things to kind of breeze through at the end. Oh, yeah, one of my favorite patristic quotes on this topic, when Irenaeus very pastorally and encouragingly reminds us that the weakness of our flesh is no impediment to God's salvation. And if it were only an offer, then we would have to worry about that. Okay, so Pontius Pilate is mentioned. I don't know about you, I thought the answer that the Catechism gave, you know, about this is so that Jesus would be judged by a temporal civil judge, that had never occurred to me, like why that would really matter. What Ursinus says in his commentary is it's important that Pilate gets mentioned because it reminds us that our faith is a historical faith. There is in Pilate's judgment, like, there's a civil judge actually saying this man is innocent, right? He says, I can find no wrong in him. But then on the other hand, what he says, like, the reason that it's important that there is this civil temporal judgment is because it reminds us that civil and temporal authority is under the authority of God. You know, as First Peter says, you know, the governing authorities are sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. And so it just says, like, this whole, you know, the death of Jesus took place in and through the means that God has appointed for judgment in the world. You know, it's significant, in other words, that the government got involved, and it wasn't just like a riot. It wasn't just a mob that hunted Jesus down and killed him. I never really thought about that before, so kind of a new idea for me, but I think there's some insight there. And then I think the last thing, you know, that last question was just, why is it significant that he was crucified in particular? And the answer it gave was, well, because crucifixion was a cursed death. And that's, you know, we just went through these verses in Galatians with Rick, that reminds us that Deuteronomy had said, cursed is everyone who's hanged on a tree. And we see Jesus bearing that curse for us. And as the Jesus Storybook Bible puts it, you know, God said to Adam, obey me about the tree. And Adam fails, but then God says to his son, obey me about this tree. And the second Adam obeys. So that kind of draws together some of our themes for the day nicely. Any last questions or comments before we wrap up here?